Welcome to the Red Table. Pull up a chair and try not to scream. It's another great day to be a horror fan. Tonight, we discuss the funny thing about horror. First of all, we're going to have a conversation with our good friend Isaac Thorne about his new book, Road Kills, and his ideas on horror and comedy and the mixing of those two genres. And then we're also going to have a discussion about the Netflix original comedy horror film, Little Evil, and that's going to be a launching pad for our discussion on the funny thing about horror.
All right, let's go.
We have and that is a capital T-H-E, the Isaac Thorne on the phone with us right now. Isaac from Nashville, Tennessee, I believe it is. How are you doing tonight, man?
I'm doing great. How are you guys? I appreciate you having me on.
It's our pleasure. We're doing great. Ladies and gentlemen, Isaac Thorne is an author. I'm holding his brand new book right now in my hand. It's called Road Kills, and you must have this book. It just came out, I believe, Isaac, is October 1st, wasn't it? Just a couple of days ago.
Yeah, that's right. It's been available for pre-order for a little while, but it just hit availability a couple of days ago. You're right.
We're going to talk Road Kills and some of your other writings in just a moment, but first of all, let's get to know you. Tell us about Isaac Thorne, what you're up to, and all that good stuff.
You know, I'm pretty much just a guy who writes. I write for my day job. I write for fun, and I love horror. I've always loved horror. You know, some of my earliest memories are of listening to like Alfred Hitchcock records and great ghost stories and things like that, and being absolutely terrified by them so much that my mother wanted to throw them out.
Because those things are full of the devil, aren't they?
Yeah, well, and not even that. She just didn't like my reaction to it.
Yeah, right.
So I don't want you up having nightmares. But there was a part of me that absolutely loved that feeling of being terrified by those images that were created in my mind from hearing those stories. So that's pretty much who I am. I've always been very entertained by horror, and I've always wanted to get into creating it fictionally. You know, yeah. As opposed to all the real world horror that we're embroiled in now. But yeah, that's pretty much me.
Well, let me ask you, because, you know, you just brought that up, and we are sitting in a moment in time when we've just experienced another great tragedy here in the United States. As of this recording, just a couple of days ago is when we had the Las Vegas shootings. I believe there was another shooting somewhere here in the Midwest that was in the midst of that as well. Of course, politics being what they are, their politics is normal. They're just, you know, ridiculous and crazy and over the top. So we're in a moment in time where a lot of emotions are heightened once again. And you talked about wanting to be into horror fictionally, but there's a bit of therapy in the genre of horror when we're facing the real world that we live in. Can you give me your thoughts on that? Why do you think we're so drawn to this genre, and why does it speak so well to us, especially in the midst of tragedy? And what does that mean to us as a people, do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think fictional horror is a way we explore the real life horrors in metaphor often. I mean, we talk about, the 50s big bug movies and things like that when everybody was afraid of the atomic bomb. And there's that element, but there's also a personal element to it. Stephen King says he writes what he's afraid of. And I very much agree with that. A lot of my work, the scary aspect of my work, sort of evolves from personal fears and just kind of you watch the news and you get ideas and you see things that happen and you wonder, what was this person thinking? What was this person feeling that would ultimately result in this scene? And I think writing this type of story helps you explore that and helps you kind of come to terms with humanity and who we are as people, and often the danger of taking our problems and our fears to extremes. So yeah, I think it is therapeutic in helping us learn to deal with ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think it's not just from a writer's perspective, but also from a reader's perspective. It allows them to escape. It allows them to face things and kind of roll things around in their head that really are taboo to talk about a lot of times. And then, we can help formulate opinions and thoughts and analysis of situations. And really, it's not just through horror. You can do that through fantasy and through other genres as well. But horror seems to just be in your face about it and doesn't pull any punches, right, and just gets right to the heart of it.
Well, and it's a very broad genre too. I mean, you can find horror in just about any situation and apply it to any situation. And that's another thing that I've always enjoyed about it is I wrote a piece for Crash Palace not long ago about George Romero and Night of the Living Dead, the 1968 film, and how at the time that I saw it, I was in college in the 90s when I saw it for the first time, and I wasn't aware of the 1960s subtext that you read about and that, everybody else was aware of. But I was able to apply that movie to me personally because I was, moving out into the world on my own for the first time and kind of felt like, the world is knocking at my door, trying to bust down my door. And I'm trying to kind of fight it off and be a kid for a little while longer,
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I also have to wonder how much of the unintentionally comedic side of horror adds to that therapy as well. And a lot of movies are terrifying the first time you see them, but you go back and watch it, in terms of horror movies anyways, and the second time you may actually find yourself laughing at certain parts here or there just because the first time you're embroiled in the intensity of the scare factor. The second time, sometimes that scare factor comes off as cheesy if you know what's coming.
Yeah, I can totally see that. I look back, I actually watched one of the more revered Nightmare on Elm Street movies not long ago. It was running on a cable station. It wasn't the DVD or anything. It was edited for television. And I think it was 3.
Yeah.
Which was more respected than 2 and not as respected as 1. But I'm watching that, and it's at the scene where Freddy is this worm-like creature coming out of the wall to, gobble up Patricia Arquette. And I'm looking at that now. Back then, I thought that was scary, seeing that up on the big screen, when it first came out. Now on television, it actually kind of looked goofy to me. Some of the dialogue in that movie just really isn't that good.
Yeah.
We just watched Friday the 13th, the first one, not too long ago, maybe a few days ago at this point.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, I'm gonna go ahead and reveal something about myself. I had never seen the original before. I've seen clips of a lot of the older ones, and I've seen the newest one, but I had never actually watched the original. So I was kind of looking forward to it to see, where that legacy started. And it was fun. There were a lot of moments, though, that it was hard not to go the riff tracks direction and point out some of the weirder aspects of the movie. So I guess my question is because a lot of horror seems to fall into that area of scary and funny at the same time. What is a draw for audiences to that? And what separates the two in the moment?
I think sometimes it's difficult to separate them, honestly, because there's something about all of us that in certain terrible situations we will burst out in laughter, and not because we necessarily think the situation is funny. It's just this reaction that we have to something that is happening to us or to someone we love or someone we see that just seems completely unbelievable and unreal in the moment. And I think that's where horror and comedy cross. I think there's a nice intersection there where you can make people laugh intentionally at a scary scene, and you can go over the top with it. Example, Evil Dead 2 and everything after that in the Evil Dead universe. But there are also movies, like my favorite vampire movie of all time is Fright Night.
Oh, you and I are friends.
I love
We are
Night.
friends for life.
And when Tom Holland friended me or followed me on Twitter, that was the highlight of my life right there.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, but that movie has both the horror and the comedy element, and it ties them together really well. You have, the scene that I have specifically in mind is when Charlie Brewster and Peter Vincent finally get into the house, and both of them are on board with, we need to destroy the vampire. And Jerry comes walking up at the top of those steps. And there's this wonderful tense moment where he's at the top of the steps and they're at the bottom of the steps, and they're looking at each other, and you think there's a fight about to begin, and Jerry looks at them and says, "Welcome to Fright Night." For real.
Yep.
And that movie was just perfection in terms of the combining of horror and comedy to me. That one and the I think it was 1986 movie House with William Catt.
Yeah. I don't remember which year.
I thought that handled it in a wonderful way. There were funny elements tied together with tense moments that just made it work.
Yeah, I've got to admit, my wife, Holly, is such a person when you talk about people having a response of laughter and fear mixed. Anytime she gets hurt or someone else gets hurt or there's a potentially dangerous situation, she actually burst out into laughter.
Mm-hmm.
And, early on when we first met, I thought, my gosh, what's wrong with me? I mean, or what's wrong with you? I mean, I could have my arm cut off and bleeding profusely and, she would just be cracking up. And I'm like, what the heck? So it is. And to be honest with you, I think it's a defense mechanism. It's the thing in our brain that allows us to switch gears or shut down certain aspects of the emotions in order to protect us, or else we'd be having psychotic breaks all over the place.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's another great reason comedy is often used as a tool in to break tension in horror, because if you have, audiences will go see something that is pure gruesome. Like in terms of horror movies where there are no light moments, but if you put the light moments in there, they're going to go see it again and they're going to talk about it more because they laughed and, they were fearful. The new It movie is another good example of that. It's a horror movie, but there are those comedic moments in there, like when, when they're in Ben Hanscom's room and Bev finds the New Kids on the Block poster on the door there.
It was awesome.
And little moments like that, just to kind of break things up, kind of help you digest the bigger disaster of it all.
Yeah, I think there's another layer to things like what it did as well, and that's nostalgia. When you can take horror or horrific events, terrifying events, and comedic events, but then you can also layer in the nostalgia, just like with the New Kids on the Block. There's so many people in the theater, I remember hearing, oh yeah, because it took them back to a moment where it was like, I loved that moment in my life.
Right.
I think there's an interesting crowd dynamic there as well. You were talking about how audiences will go and see a movie that's completely gruesome and completely serious, but they're going to remember it better if it's got some of that light moment to it. And I was trying to think back through some horror movies that were completely serious and think of times when people, when I've still talked about that with people or when other people have brought it up to me. And I think one was The Strangers. But thinking about it, The Strangers was a very serious movie. I think part of the thing that stuck in my mind, though, was the audience reaction to that movie. It's always funny to see people in the audience say, oh, no, you don't. Don't go in there, you idiot.
Mm-hmm.
And you always have people cracking up a couple rows away from them. And it's an interesting thing to see people react to movies, just like Friday the 13th as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some very stupid decisions were made by the characters in that movie. But that's part of the fun of it.
And that brings up another good point. I think the horror comedy element actually works better in that theatrical dynamic versus when, say, you're watching it on television at home alone. Because when you're laughing with other people. When you're screaming with other people. And there's something about that connection between you and the other members of the audience, even though you're not really looking at each other or talking to each other, you're sharing that experience. It's the same reason people watch the news, Speaking of the tragedies we've seen on the news lately, mixed in with the horrible stories, they tell stories of heroism,
right?
Related to that, and it's because they want you to feel what those people are feeling, and I think that's it's just a good way to bring people together.
Yeah, or relational type stories. This
Right.
couple was engaged and had their whole life. It's touching, it's moving, it's very sad. We understand that, and we connect to it on that human level. So
Right.
again, that's what horror does. And I'll be honest with you, any horror that doesn't add that comedic break in there, if it takes itself too seriously, it better do it damn good, or you've lost your
Right.
audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you there. And there are some movies that I have never sat down and watched just because I know there's most likely no comedic element in them. I've never seen Cannibal Holocaust, for example. And
I'm probably with you there.
yeah, I don't want to. Even before I knew about the actual, real, genuine animal cruelty in the movie, I had no desire to see that movie. So there are a few things that I won't sit through, and I hate to prejudge any film, but I just didn't really see any, or I've never thought that I would like to sit down and watch that movie because I'm certain there are no breaks in it.
Yeah.
That it's just, one long shot, basically, of gruesome.
Yeah, definitely. So let's switch gears because, again, I'm holding your new book in my hand. And this book, Road Kills, was just released a couple days ago. Actually has some of my favorite work that you've done. The work that I actually was first introduced to you with. And it's got some new stuff. This book is a collection of both old and new work and older works that have become newer works because of their format, if I'm saying that correctly. So
Yeah.
Let's talk about Road Kills. Give us your thoughts first, and let's dive into a couple of specifics about it. I know you're excited, new book out on the market just in time
absolutely.
for Halloween. You write from a horror and comedy aspect. You mix
Yes.
those elements. So talk to us about these stories in this collection.
Believe it or not, the first story that I sat down and wrote and released is in that book, and it's titled Nobody Was Here. That one was based on well, I say based on a true story. It was inspired by a true event that happened to me on my way back from New Orleans through Alabama when I stopped off at a restaurant to use the restroom and was confronted by another gentleman in the restroom. I managed to get away from him, but that whole event kind of set me on edge and inspired that story. But when I started writing that story, I intended to focus on the horror of it, but the comedy just kind of kept creeping in there because I kept thinking about what a kind of a ridiculous situation this guy was in, that he's not physically restrained in this restroom with this other man who's trying to, do whatever to him. And the guy doesn't really know what the other guy wants, but, he can open the door and leave, but he doesn't feel like he can. So it's kind of it's a really ridiculous situation. There's a polite part of human nature that doesn't want to just walk away from somebody. And I kind of wanted to capture the ridiculousness of that. So I'm writing this and the comedy just kept creeping in. And I started to realize that a lot of horror really is about the ridiculousness of the situation you're in. And I want the reader to know that I'm in on that I get it. If you're reading this and you think, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Why doesn't he just do this? I'm thinking the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
So that's where the comedy blend kind of came in. And once I started writing these things, when I got the idea to bring the collection about, I started kind of searching for a theme. I didn't want to just throw a bunch of completely unrelated stories, between covers and call it a collection. I wanted them to be related somehow. And I noticed that the majority of the stories I write, for some reason, have a connection to the road and to travel. So that's where the idea for roadkills came from. If they don't take place on the road, there's still an element of a journey in the story. In fact, I think there are only two of them that really don't have the element of actual travel on a physical road involved in them. So that's how the whole collection came about.
And those stories that don't have a physical traveling, I think, have a bit of a spiritual or emotional journey involved with it. And
absolutely.
I think you actually wrote this in the foreword of this book, which, by the way, is about as interesting piece of writing as the stories themselves. So it's just
well, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's just really an enjoyable time to sit down and read an Isaac Thorne story. So, I really appreciate everything that you put in, even to the foreword and the notes behind the stories. And I think it's well worth, whether you're an ebook reader or a physical book reader. I love physical books more than electronic, but either way, it's just an enjoyable experience to sit down with Isaac Thorne's writing. Now, that same year, I think that you put out Nobody Was Here. I believe it was the same year that one of the stories that you're probably pretty well known for came out as well, and that's Hoppers. And
right.
And I'm actually sitting here as well in my book package that you sent me when I got the book. The little evil bunny stickers, which I absolutely adore. They're with me on my desk and everything now. So
awesome.
Hoppers is something that I think I actually first learned about you because of that story. Talk to us about that story. I think it's just an enduring piece of writing.
Hoppers has a special place in my heart because it was the first time that I really intentionally tried to mash the horror and the comedy together in a sort of Evil Dead 2 and beyond over-the-top style.
Yeah.
But the whole thing came from just the fact that I have this soft spot for animals and I can't stand to see one hit in the road. And when you live in rural Tennessee, you see that all the time, whether it's a rabbit, a possum, or an armadillo, or a raccoon, or whatever, or a deer even.
Yeah.
You see that all the time here, especially in the spring and fall.
Right.
Or late fall.
Breeding seasons.
Right, exactly.
These animals running out across the road, chasing each other or trying to get away. And, here's this road running right through their path.
Exactly. And I always think whenever I see that, I always, put myself in the position of the person who hit that animal. And I think, okay, did I stop and worry about it? Did I think, oh, well, that happens, and keep going? And what if the animal I hit came back from the dead and wanted revenge? And once that thought crept in there, the rest of the story just kind of took off.
As they do.
That's all she wrote, as they say.
Yeah.
Stories have a way of doing that sometimes.
So in this collection, and I'm going to tell on myself here, but in this collection is actually so far my favorite piece of writing from you, and that's Diggum. And
oh, yes.
Yeah. Now, the first time I actually was introduced to Diggum was not through print, but audio. And it's when I signed up for your newsletter. By the way, folks, if you want a fantastic newsletter to sign up for, and one that has real value, you need to sign up for Isaac's newsletter. And in your newsletters, a lot of times you send out stories, and that's where I first heard of Diggum. I think it was during a time when you were doing, I don't know, a giveaway or something for the audio version of this book, or maybe I got it when I got the ebook. I can't remember. But I stay up late at night working, and a lot of times kind of my unwinding period is preparing meals for the next day in the middle of the night. I know it sounds weird, but that's kind of what I do. And while I'm doing that, I like to listen to stories or podcasts or talks from other people. And that's when I first listened to Diggum. Man, I was taken. I was like, this is it. It has all the right elements to it. And then I'm listening to it and I'm just like, his voice. I need to talk to this man. Because the treatment you give to the voice is just outstanding. And so kudos to you on just a great piece of writing, audibly and in writing. And so that's one of my favorite. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on Diggum? Because I think that's probably growing to be a very popular piece for you as well.
It does seem to be, and I don't know if that's, because of the story or because of the audio or what, but Diggum, the written story kind of turned into a passion project for me. I mean, it started out just as a generic person who's struggling with grief and loss idea. And a lot of people, if they have a religious background, when they grieve for the first time, they ask, why me? Why did you do this? How could you? You're supposed to be benevolent.
Right. Are you even real now? Are
you even real now? Exactly. And that's what I wanted this character to explore. I've known a lot of people in my life who have fought that battle. So I wanted this character to explore that. And once I had that was one of those stories that was just written in a fever. I wrote that, and it's one of the longer stories, but I wrote it just over a few days. And once I had it written, I at the time was providing scripts of some of my stories to Leanne Moonraven of Carmen Online Theater Group. She did an audio version of Because Reasons. So I was kind of in that frame of mind anyway, the audio drama frame of mind. So I thought, well, what if I sat down and just read this in front of a microphone? And if I were this guy, what would I sound like? So I sat down and started reading, and that's the voice that came out. And, if you've listened to it, Diggum he sounds older and hoarse. He's been around a while, and his lungs are full of dust and the earth because of what he does. So that's how the audio version came about, and it was really well received when it first aired on Carmen Theater Group. So I decided to put it out as an audiobook after that, and subsequently it ended up on my Scream radio program with a few sound effects added. I think Diggum is probably the story at this point that I'm most proud of, if I can take some pride in my work there.
Yeah, and you should, yes.
So yeah, that one was a really passionate project for me, and I'm glad it's been well received.
Well, and the other part of this, which I have not set down, I've skimmed it, but I haven't sat down and fully read this, but a part of this collection of stories, you've also re-released Diggum as a screenplay, which, if I'm not mistaken now, you have entered that, or I'm not sure how all that works, but it's in some film festivals, and
yes.
It's a screenplay now. So how did that come about? Where does that take you with a story like this?
The interesting thing about that, I have people approach me, and like Leanne Moonraven with Carmen approached me and said, I'd like to turn some of your stories into audio plays. A little bit later, My Little Rascal Productions approached me and said, we'd like to turn some of your stories into short horror films. So I say, great, go for it. And then I see what they do with them, and I'm just astounded with how you can take a story and translate it to this other medium and be able to tell the same story, but in a slightly different way, or based on the medium, you've chosen a better way for that medium. And I was fascinated by the scripts that My Little Rascal was sending back to me based on my work, and seeing my characters and story, come to life through their eyes in a more visual format. So I wondered, I had just finished the audio version of Diggum at that point. My Little Rascal is their first film based on one of my works is going to be Because Reasons.
Okay.
So they're doing a short film of that, and they sent me that script, and I read it, and I was enthralled, and I thought, I'm going to try this just on my own with Diggum, since it's fresh in my mind, and I can see the events in my head, as if I were watching them on a movie screen. And when I wrote the audio play, I thought, somebody could take this audio play and do like Robert Kirkman style drawings to it, and do like a semi-animated movie, just built around the narration. So I took that idea and built on it and turned it into, what could ultimately be a live action, about a half-hour short. And I thought of it as kind of a Tales from the Crypt or Twilight Zone episode style script. So yeah, that's how that came about. And I just kind of on a lark submitted it to some screenplay contests related to film festivals in Film Freeway, and it's gotten some good attention. It's received one actual award for best violence.
Wow.
From the Chemical Film Festival. But it has been selected and made it to finalist status in several others. I don't have an actual count now, but a few of those festivals are actually occurring within the next 2 weeks, October 13th, that weekend, and I think the next couple of weekends after. So I get to find out then if Diggum made it past the finals on some of those.
Very good. Well, man, we're over here cheering for you on that one.
Thank you very much.
That's phenomenal.
I would love to see that come to life visually.
I would too.
I think that's every author's dream at some point.
Definitely.
I have to say, Diggum caught me off guard from the first page, or maybe it was a few pages after that he makes a statement, but there's a moment where he talks about not being afraid of anything. And yes, he deals with the grief early on in the story, but the timeline, if you will, you kind of get a sense that he's speaking kind of from the end of the journey or near the end of his life from the get-go. And it struck me as interesting. The first few pages, I was wondering, well, how is this going to be scary? How is this going to be a good horror story? because of that philosophy that he starts out where, I'm not afraid of anything. I've kind of been through hell already, so there's nothing that can really take me off guard. And I saw that unfold and saw where the true horror starts to come in. I really enjoyed that part. And you have some stories throughout the years that are like this, kind of like The Telltale Heart or Reanimator, where the character themselves, the narrator, the person that you're riding in the passenger seat with, is the driving force of horror. And I have to kind of pick your brain on that because I don't know why this story in particular stood out to me so much, but it was very effective in doing that.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I guess I have to ask, how do you make that effective, number one? And then number two, which do you prefer? The type of story where you have somebody encountering horror and working themselves through that, or the story where you are the horror?
Michael, he makes it work because he is the Isaac Thorne.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I'll tell you, Diggum was actually as much a surprise to me as it was to anyone reading it for the first time. When I sat down to write it, like I said, all I knew was I wanted him to deal with grief and to ask those questions that anybody asks. But I didn't actually know where this was going. I knew that he was telling this story, in the first person. Therefore, he's talking to someone. But the twist, I guess, as you get close to the end of that, I didn't even really see coming. And that's kind of a non-answer, but that's actually the way it works.
Well, again, I think stories do that to us sometimes.
You're so modest.
And for your other question, though, I like taking a character and allowing that character to either encounter the horror or discover that they are the horror. I don't necessarily want a character to know from the outset that they are the horror. But nobody was here. For example, you get into that story and you kind of start to ask yourself whether nobody is the horror or the would-be protagonist is the horror because of the way things go in that one. So, I'm not sure I really have a preference there. I think it depends on who the character is and who they turn out to be based on the choices they make.
That's very cool, and I can't wait to hear the news coming in the next several weeks about these contests that you're entering, and I'm sure you'll be announcing stuff over social media. I know we talk to you a lot via Twitter, and we'll put your links in show notes and everything. Folks, I would encourage you to connect with Isaac and stay up to date. Certainly, in my opinion, someone to pay attention to. I think people should have been paying attention to you already, but I think you're on a steep growth right now that is going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next few years. A lot of your collection that you've released here with Road Kills, we've mentioned how some of it is your previous work. It represents a portion of your work all the way back to, I think, around 2013, but nearly half of the book is brand new material.
Yes.
And, just released late 2016 and throughout the course of 2017. What can you tell us about some of the newer stories and maybe give us an idea comparatively between the older stuff and the newer stuff? Where do you think you're at as a writer, and particularly within the horror community?
Well, the newer stuff, I think, is much more focused than the older things. Every writer, of course, rewrites and there's still that process. But I think now when I sit down to write a story and create a scene, it's not that I necessarily know where things are going, but I know where not to go.
Yeah.
A lot of first-time writers in particular, when they sit down, they'll start describing a character and you get, the color underneath their fingernails eventually, and a lot of things that aren't necessary and that the reader really doesn't care about and are just fluff to kind of bump up the word count. I think along the way I've gotten better about getting rid of that and not being married to my descriptive powers. Some of the new stuff in there, once I determined that I wanted to do a collection, I wanted to not only have the overriding theme, but I wanted to have a beginning, a middle, and an end that tied everything together. And that's why there are 3 Tiffany stories in the book instead of just Because Reasons. When I first wrote Because Reasons, and I'm assuming you guys have read that one. I don't know if you have or not, but the way that one ends is a bit open-ended. And I did not intend to write more about her when I finished that story. But when the collection came together, I thought it would be nice to actually see what happens next for her. So not only does Tiffany begin the collection, she is the middle, and she has the last story in it as well to kind of, put a bow on things.
And Because Reasons, if I'm not mistaken, I've read recently, maybe through your newsletter, I'm not sure, but isn't Because Reasons the one that has recently been cast for filming?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, My Little Rascal will be, in fact, they already have a filming date for that one. It's first week of November. They'll be shooting that one. So
okay, is that is that the only one that they're filming currently?
Currently, yes. They actually contracted with me for 3 stories.
Okay. Maybe that's why I felt like there was already another film in the works, but maybe it's just I'm overlapping in my head. But Because Reasons, I do remember you sharing an announcement of the actor that was cast for the main role and that was in production.
Yes. The other 2 stories that they've written screenplays for are Nobody Was Here and Hoppers, which they've actually retitled The Road.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So hopefully those will come short on the heels of Because Reasons, but I'm really looking forward to seeing Tiffany come to life on screen there.
Isaac, we've taken up a lot of your time this evening. I appreciate you giving us this time. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you, and we haven't had this opportunity to really talk at length about your work or even just hang out. So it's been a pleasure. I've got to ask though. I'm going to go back to Diggum because I have to. Because Michael can tell you, anybody who listens to the Monster Guys podcast can tell you that I love accents. I love foreign accents. I love treatments on voices. And again, when I listened to Diggum, I was just like, this guy.
I can tell you every time that that you've come up in conversation, he does bring up that aspect.
I always tell Michael, you have to go listen to the audio. So my real question, and this is kind of funny because I've lived in the South. I'm actually from Orlando, but I've lived in different places in the South, and I've worked throughout the Southeast. The South has a very unique accent, and each state within the South has a very unique accent. You have a wonderful speaking voice, but you don't really have that Southern accent. How do you live in Tennessee and escape the accent? Because it's thick where you live.
It is thick where I live. And, I have been asked that question many times.
I can't imagine why.
And, sometimes it creeps out there.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
But I went for a time to journalism school, and that's the only way I can explain it. I have a naturally deep, I guess deep is the right word for it, voice, but after I went to journalism school, I think that's probably what polished it there, because I had to get used to hearing myself played back to my own ears, and I didn't particularly like the way I sounded. So I tried to do what I could,
I actually have a couple of people that we've invited to be on the show who will not be on the show, won't be on any show because of the fear they have of hearing their own voice. It's a legitimate fear that they have, so they won't even do a show.
Wow.
Yeah. So
well, and I can understand that. I mean, I think most people prefer not to hear themselves outside their own heads.
Yeah. It's safer that
But yeah, absolutely. I can totally understand that.
Isaac, your new book, Road Kills, is out right now. People listening, if you're a horror fan, if you're a dark fiction fan, if you're just a good literature fan, you need to get a hold of this. It's a great collection because, again, it deals with some of your earlier work, some of your more recent work, but also things like the Diggum screenplay. It gives us a different take, and that is always a really fascinating thing to have in print. So kudos to you. I would encourage anybody to get their hands on this. You also have these and many other stories on audio, on ebook, and available through different means. Tell us how to do that. I know your website, but give us the down low. How do we get Isaac Thorne's work and your newsletter and all that good stuff?
Absolutely. IsaacThorne.com, and that's Thorne with an E. You can sign up for the newsletter there. There are links to the books in both ebook and paperback, to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that. If you buy the paperback book through my site directly, you can get an autographed copy for a few dollars more than regular print price. And Twitter, you can find me at Isaac R. Thorne, the same on Facebook. And you can also find me on screamradio.com, scrmradio.com. You can find me on Thorne's Theater of Terror and doing a few short classic cuts from time to time.
Yeah, I recently listened to you narrate The Portrait of Dorian Gray, and it was just a great job. That's actually, Michael, one of your favorite books.
Yep, it's actually sitting right in front of us right now on the table as well. That's
Nice.
one of my all-time favorite stories.
So you're on Scream Radio. Your Theater of Terror is a joy to listen to.
Yeah, Classic Cuts airs at various times. It has no particular schedule. Thorne's Theater of Terror airs typically 3 times a day, once in the early morning, once in the afternoon, and once late at night.
Well, folks, if you want to hear Isaac Thorne, you can definitely hear him various times on Scream Radio. Go to isaacthorne.com. We'll have the links in the show notes. Hit him up on Twitter. I don't know that I know many people that are as active as you on Twitter and as generous as you are on Twitter. So I definitely would hook up with him there. But get your hands on Road Kills. This is a stunning collection of stories, and it's got everything a horror fan, a dark fiction fan would want. Plus, I'm pretty sure, Isaac, maybe I'll have to buy these from you for saying this, but if you buy a book from Isaac directly, get it signed, you probably will get one of those little evil bunny stickers to go with it.
You will, actually, as long as I can keep getting them printed. Okay. I will include them with a signed copy of the book,
because they are definitely worth it. We've posted some pictures on our Twitter and I think our Instagram, and we'll post some more along with the interview. But ladies and gentlemen, Isaac Thorne, thank you very much, sir, for being with us on Welcome to the Red Table tonight. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, guys.
Great talking with Isaac Thorne on the show today. Just a real pleasure to speak with that guy.
Yeah, very smart, very funny, and very well versed in the realm of horror.
Yes, he is. Let's continue our discussion about comedy horror. Before we get too far in it, we're going to discuss a little bit about the Netflix original film Little Evil that came out not too long ago, and we're just going to kind of use that as a launching pad for a bigger discussion. But before we get into that, Michael, what would you consider your favorite comedy horror film?
That's a really difficult one. I have a few.
Well, let's hear them.
I don't know. I think Zombieland probably has to be up there in the top 3. Shaun of the Dead, of course. And what was the last one called? At World's End?
The World's End. Yeah, those would be my 3. Shaun of the Dead, Zombieland, The World's End.
You're copying me.
I might be copying you, but I don't care.
Those 3 are just really snappy, really fun, really fast-paced, and they hit all the right marks.
You know what? I'd have to include Fright Night in there, even though I'm not sure that people would categorize it as comedy horror. I always did. I always thought it was hilarious and frightening all at the same time, and I thought it had just, and I think we talked about this with Isaac just a few minutes ago, but I think it had just a perfect mix of the 2 elements in that film. I don't know, between Shaun of the Dead and The World's End, I'm at a loss A lot of people don't necessarily consider The World's End so much horror as it is sci-fi. I would still consider it horror, but man, the soundtrack for that one just is amazing.
Yeah, I had actually forgotten about the soundtrack aspect. They pull out a lot of the 80s synth.
Oh my gosh. The moment they started playing Sisters of Mercy, I lost it. I don't know. There's a lot of elements to all of that. You know, you could go as far back as to stuff like Ghostbusters. Some people consider that comedy horror. Tucker and Dale versus Evil, Army of Darkness, I mean...
The Evil Dead series
The Evil Dead series. You could just pull them out of a hat.
Cabin in the Woods, I forgot about for a second.
Yeah, people consider that comedy horror.
I would probably put Cabin in the Woods before World's End.
Well, that would be your prerogative, I guess. But then, you know, you have just completely slapstick humor in stuff like, oh gosh, the name escapes me, the parody off of Scream.
Scary
Movie, and some people would put that in the same category. I don't think I would. I think that reaches beyond the boundary and just says, we're just going to make fun of it, you know, for the fun of it. Things like Medea's Halloween, I think it was called last year, or Boo or something like that. I wouldn't consider those horror. I would consider those comedy on purpose. But there's a lot of people that would mix those two things.
And that's part of what we're talking about tonight, is the fact that so many people draw the line in different places.
Well, where I draw the line is correct. And everybody should just realize that. So, discussion's over. We're going home.
All right. I guess that was tonight's episode of Welcome to the Red Table, ladies and gentlemen.
We are done.
But yeah, a lot of people draw that line in very different places. I was talking to Cheyenne, my fiance, about one of her favorite movies, which is Young Frankenstein, being a horror comedy. And she didn't really get the angle I was coming from at first, and I didn't understand what she was asking. She clarified and said that she didn't think Young Frankenstein was a horror comedy movie. It was just a comedy movie.
Hold that thought. Let's come back to that. First of all, tell me your thoughts on Little Evil.
Okay.
And we're going to round back around to this conversation, doing this on purpose this way, but give me your thoughts on Netflix original Little Evil.
I thought Little Evil was fantastic. I have to say.
And you got a lot of people that are going to be like shaking their heads, and some maybe even have violent reactions right now to that statement, because there's a lot of people that hated that flick.
It's interesting. There was one gentleman, well, I guess gentleman would be one word, but there was one person online that was ragging on it pretty hard, but then he turned around and ragged on Shaun of the Dead and I think Cabin in the Woods pretty hard as well.
What?
Yeah. So that's the thing, is he was saying
in touch with
that it was a trash movie because it didn't do, what it was supposed to do. And then somebody...
What was it supposed to do?
He was saying that it wasn't enough horror, I guess. But then he brought Evil Dead into the picture, and somebody else went off on him saying that Evil Dead was a trash series. So it can get pretty volatile sometimes, the opinions. I liked Little Evil. I thought it was...
Now I know how to start a fight. Just bring up these movies.
I think it did really well in what it was. And what Little Evil did, it focused on the stereotypes and the archetypes of horror movies all throughout. That was the entire gimmick of the movie. And I say gimmick, it wasn't too cheesy to me. It was meant to be cheesy in the places that it was, but it did that well.
Yeah, it purposefully did not take itself serious at all.
Yeah.
It satirized a lot of horror themes like you were talking about, but it did it on purpose. It did not take itself seriously. However, it did have some creepy elements, some scary elements, some elements that most people would consider horror. It wasn't just all funny. It wasn't a comedy. It was a comedy horror. There was a mixing of genres on purpose.
It took a different angle where the main character, he definitely was afraid, but he was trying to be a legitimate stepfather, and he was trying to do a good job of it. You have that rite of passage story in there as well.
Yeah, and I've said this before, and I think we talked about this with Isaac, that any horror film that takes itself too seriously potentially fails big. I think any comedy horror that isn't serious enough about the horror potentially fails big as well. I think Little Evil had a good balance between the two. I was talking to you about the style of the movie. Because it was a Netflix film, to me, when I'm watching Netflix originals, and there are very few who do not do this, but if I'm watching a Netflix film, there seems to be a cleanliness about it. You can have all the blood and guts and gore, but it still seems to be clean. Clean production, high-level filming, clean cuts, great editing, all that kind of stuff. It's almost like a Hollywood movie that was made for TV in terms of its style, but it was definitely a movie.
It would make sense, especially being made for Netflix. It wasn't necessarily made for the big screen, so that's a very different experience.
Yeah, and I'm having difficulty wrapping my words around this because I can watch other indie films or TV, made for TV type films, and there's still a lot of grunginess to it. There's a lot of rough edges, and it's not bad. It's just meant to be that way. Netflix cleans a lot of that up in their production. It's kind of like the Drew Barrymore series, the Santa Clarita Diet, I believe it was called on Netflix. Zombie type flick going on. It was a series. It wasn't just a movie, but it was gory. I've only watched the first several episodes, but it was gory. It was bloody, but it was clean. It's kind of strange to describe it, but there was
it's neat and tidy.
Very neat and tidy gore, neat and tidy horror. That's what Netflix is going for stylistically in order to appeal to its target audience. Now, let me say, from a production level, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I enjoy Little Evil, but I like watching movies like that to get a kick out of it, to get a laugh out of it, and to pick out all the references that it hits on. The same thing with Santa Clarita Diet. It just was funny. It was neat and tidy. It was tight production. And then you had big names like Drew Barrymore in there just pulling off some cool stuff. But, I believe there's a style that a lot of horror fans expect when they watch horror, whether it's straight horror or horror comedy. And there still needs to be some rough edges. There needs to be some grunginess. And I believe those fans who may watch a show like Little Evil aren't going to enjoy it as much because it's so neat and tidy, but I believe there's a different audience that's being targeted there.
It's important to note as well that there was a specific audience, I think, looking for that from this director. This movie was written and directed by Eli Craig, the same mastermind behind Tucker and Dale vs. Evil.
Yeah.
And that was definitely a grungy movie.
Yeah, it was.
You've got two hillbilly guys, so, they're out in the woods. They're probably very smelly. You see the dirt all over their arms and legs as they're doing their work. And then there's a lot of blood and guts and gore that show up throughout. He kept his quick cuts, jump scenes, the fast, almost Guy Ritchie style shot. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people attribute that to inspiration from movies like Shaun of the Dead as well. But it's definitely a different feel and a different style from Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. So I think the audience that really enjoyed that movie, they've been waiting for a few years, at least, for him to put out a new movie. And this wasn't quite what everybody was expecting.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here, what he does next. But yeah, I liked Little Evil for what it was. It was enjoyable. I got a lot of good laughs out of it. I loved a lot of the references, for me picking out things like the cornfield, that kind of stuff I enjoy in a film.
The twin girls from The Shining.
The twin girls, the clowns, all the crazy stuff that you can reference back to so many other horror movies.
Yeah, and it did have a lot of laugh out loud moments. I think one of the elements that I thought was going to be kind of boring after a few times was the talking goat puppet, Leroy. Yeah. Basically, the devil talks.
I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, it was very well timed, and that didn't get old to me. So it's interesting reading reviews and reading analysis of this movie. There was one article that was talking about how it was a movie with a lot of heart and not much else. And then another article a few pages down said basically the exact opposite, saying that it was a mess and it didn't have any heart whatsoever. So people are really divided on this movie.
Well, and I think one of the great things that happened with that movie was the focus on the relationship.
Yeah.
Between the stepdad and the kid. I believe that was the element that brought it all together. and kept it in check. Without that, this was just joke after joke, jump after jump, and it was just a whole bunch of nothing. But that relationship coursing throughout brought the story together. And like I said, little things like finding references to other horror films or the goat puppet. I love stuff like the goat puppet. So I thought that was hilarious. Then at the end, the twist, seeing a lot more of the big budget type effects go into the ending scene. There was a lot of good things about this film that I think should be appreciated more than it is being appreciated.
Yeah. And still, I think that's just our opinion. So go watch the film without us swaying you one way or another. But I think you do have to keep some of those elements in mind. This isn't Shaun of the Dead. This isn't Tucker and Dale versus Evil. This is its own thing. So as much as we compare one movie to any other movie, I don't think you need to go in watching Little Evil already comparing it to other horror comedy staples.
Yeah, you can't. You can't do that. And the main actor, right? Is it Adam Scott?
I believe so, yeah.
He's doing several of this style of film or series right now. He's doing others that are still in that comedy horror genre. So he's carving out a little niche for himself, and I think he pulls it off really well.
Yeah. I think the other thing coming out right now is called Ghosted. That does actually look funny, like a paranormal investigation bureau, and he plays kind of the average guy that's not really good at that job. It looks funny. He's definitely found an interesting home.
So as far as I'm concerned, I would recommend watching the movie and enjoying it for what it is. Have a few laughs, have a few touching moments, the story of the relationship, and enjoy that ending scene that kind of blows it all out of proportion and makes it really fun. I think it's worth seeing.
And it's on Netflix, so it's not like, if you have Netflix, it's not like you have to go pay rental fee or ticket price or anything like that. So
going back to the beginning part of this conversation, you were talking about Cheyenne and watching Young Frankenstein and whether or not it's considered horror at all, and movies like that. What do we say to that? How do we define comedy horror? Does it still belong in the horror category?
I think absolutely. And this is just my viewpoint on it. Listeners, you'll have to write in if you disagree and kind of explain why. Raise that flag up.
What are we, a 1980s radio show? Write in.
Tweet in, email in, text in somehow.
Get your pencil and paper ready. I feel like Casey Kasem. And I'm going to write down the address where you can write us today.
We'll take live calls starting in 5 minutes. There's another conversation that I've had a few times with a good friend of mine about horror. He is bored by horror. He's not the type to get scared on, going through a haunted house or anything. He's just boring like that, sadly.
Or he's covering it up and he's terrified inside.
I guess that would be a pretty good act if he was doing that. But he doesn't watch horror for that reason. But he likes things with good stories. So there are a lot of movies that I'll point him toward because I know he would like the mythology, the monsters, the creatures and stuff, and the lore behind the horror movie. But he never sits down to watch it because he doesn't want to watch what he thinks is going to be full of jump scares and, shock value horror. And while that is a big part of the genre of horror and its subgenres, I think a lot of people do make that distinction where horror is just a bunch of jump scares or blood and guts and gore or slasher films, and that's not the case. Horror comedy kind of falls into that same boat. A lot of horror comedy, while it may have shock value or gore, like Zombieland, Shaun of the Dead, obviously those have a lot of blood, guts, and gore, they aren't really scary. They don't have a lot of jump scares. The topics, the horrifying things that they deal with are more issues of the heart or of the mind. In Zombieland, you are basically dealing with a group of people that are looking back on the things that they're missing from when the world was still, the world as we know it. So they're letting go of that past.
Yeah, there's a lot of great story to the film. It's not just a bunch of special effects or pop out of the can type stuff.
Yeah. Little Evil, to go to that, you have a guy who's dealing with, I've got almost everything I wanted, but my new stepson is the literal son of the devil. So do I continue on with this life that I think that I want, or do I put an end to it somehow? Then you have things like Young Frankenstein, where the main character deals with the fear of being associated with his family's history and his family's legacy. So he fights against that and rails against that for the entire movie. So it's not outright jump scare. It's not outright, ooh, that spooks me out. But it's still something that deals with a distressed mind or a distressed heart and soul. So I don't know. To me, that still encompasses horror.
I tell you what, I look at it this way. Take the comedy aspect out of a comedy horror film, and if it's still terrifying to think about without the jokes, without the funny parts, you've got a horror movie. Take the comics out, take the funny out, take the jokes out, take the slapstick out, and tell me if that story isn't horrifying by itself.
That's a good point.
Now put the comedy back in, because, again, like we spoke about a little bit earlier with Isaac, the human brain, the human mind, the human spirit, for that matter, can't take that level of an intensity all the time. So you have to break it. We do that with comedy. It's why people respond to pain with laughter, or to other people's pain with laughter. Or some people respond to those situations with sarcasm or lashing out in some other way that breaks them from the terrifying intensity that is affecting them. So the same thing with horror comedy or comedy horror, however you want to slant that. Take the funny part out. Do you have a terrifying situation? I see a lot of horror in a lot of those movies. Now, take that example and apply it to just a comedy. Take the comedy out of a comedy, what do you have left? Probably just some guy sitting on a bench watching people.
I guess a drama? I don't know.
A drama? I don't know, but specifically comedy horror truly mixes both of those elements in a balance. And they both have to be there. So I think you have some movies that would like to claim to be comedy horror, but they're not really. Because if you take one or the other elements out of there, you don't have the other elements standing alone. But stuff like Zombieland, take the funny out of that and think about that situation. It's horrifying. It's a terrifying, debilitating situation that you find yourself in.
And what's funny is you and I are both fans of Zombieland, you and I are both fans of Shaun of the Dead, but we're not typically fans of zombie movies. There are some good ones out there, but...
I'm not a big fan of zombie movies at all. Now, I like some classic stuff. You go way back to the 30s and stuff, and I like some of that stuff. I like some of Romero's work, but...
And then Train to Busan.
Yeah, Train to Busan. Oh, man.
That also had elements of
a lot
funny.
Of comedy.
Yeah.
A lot of comedy. And a lot of people wouldn't even be able to pick out a lot of the comedy that was integrated in that movie because of the intensity and the spatial claustrophobia that was involved in that movie. But it had a lot of funny moments.
Yeah, to be fair, that one doesn't claim to be a horror comedy either,
right.
But it definitely lightens the mood at times.
Because we have to have that break. We have to have a mental and emotional and even a spiritual break, or we break.
And then you have the other end of the spectrum. You have movies that don't try to be horror. I'm thinking, well, the second thought that comes to my mind are movies like Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have movies that don't try to do it like Friday the 13th, which I don't know if I'm going to get any arrows shot at me from that. But I have to say, Friday the 13th, I was kind of laughing my head off while watching the final events in that movie.
Yeah.
But while I don't think those fall into comedy horror as a genre, they are fun to watch.
Let me put that in a little bit of perspective. Back when it first came out, as a kid growing up, there's this mystery about it. There's this taboo about it. I remember as a kid, friends, all of us getting together and thinking we're going to go to the video store and rent Friday the 13th, or we're going to rent something scary because we're not supposed to.
Yeah.
And the whole thing about it is it's terrifying, not because of the movie itself, but because we weren't supposed to see it. And then you take it home and you watch it, and most of the time you're not even half paying attention to it. You just know you're watching this scary movie and you're not supposed to be, so you're more afraid of who's going to walk in and find you watching the movie than you are of the movie. Then you watch it 20 or 30 years later, and you're like, holy cow, this is hilarious. Are you kidding me? That's not even possible. It's not physiologically possible. It's not humanly possible at all. This is absolutely hilarious. I want to watch it again just to make fun of it.
Yeah. Digging back further into time, you also have the giant insect movies and the sci-fi movies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel like maybe after a couple of generations, every horror movie becomes a horror comedy just by nature of
yeah, probably has to. And I think the intensity of the world we live in plays into that a little bit.
Yeah,
there are different stressors that are present as we move through history that, you kind of look back on the stressors of yesterday and you have a different perspective on them.
That is true. And it's interesting to note that horror comedies of today play upon those stressors just as good, as if not better, than most straight up horror films.
Yeah.
Watching Hot Fuzz, which maybe it's not straight horror comedy, but it definitely has a lot of dark, freaky moments in it. Watching some of the scenes of people dying in that and getting messed up, that's very stressful at times and unexpected. So it's an interesting roundabout on horror comedy.
So I definitely believe there's a place for comedy horror within the horror community. I definitely believe it has its place, and people are going to argue about this from now till eternity. I think we just have to accept that, but realize that horror is most effective when it allows the break of comedy to seep through. And it doesn't always have to be direct. It can be subtle. It can be under the breath, but it's there. And my personal opinion is, again, any horror film that takes itself too seriously really sets itself up for failure.
Yeah.
If it doesn't allow the break, if it doesn't allow people to breathe and recover and laugh, even if it's giving them the opportunity to laugh at their own chills running up and down their spine and how silly it seems to get so frightened over something they're watching that's not real. You've got to find a way to allow those moments to seep in, or you lose the effectiveness of horror.
Well, you get the full range of emotions.
Yeah.
If you just have fear, then that starts to get old. But if you've got fear and you've got joy, then you appreciate the fear more.
Yeah, I know a few people that are all about the fear stuff, and I gotta be honest with you, I'm not sure they're walking a straight line most of the time, so I have to keep my eye out on some of those guys, but...
I feel like at that point, that's... endorphins are released, that is their joy.
Yeah, so... I don't know, I enjoyed Little Evil. I enjoy a good comedy horror flick. I'm looking forward to a few that are on their way to us. I certainly haven't watched all of them, and I haven't gotten into all of them. Like I said, watching that one with Drew Barrymore, I think I got about 4 episodes in, and not that it was bad, not that it wasn't good. I think I was just done, and I was on to something else. But that's just me. I do that with a lot of genres and a lot of different series.
I'm looking forward to seeing what Eli Craig comes up with next. I know he almost directed the Amazon Prime series Zombieland before that was canceled. I think he did direct the pilot episode, but it didn't move past that. So I'm curious to see what he does after Little Evil, how he responds to fans, and what he comes up with next.
Absolutely. Well, good talk, and it was great talking with Isaac. Isaac, if you're listening still, thanks for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. If you have any thoughts on this topic, comedy, horror comedy, let us know about them. TheMonsterGuys.com. Tweet us at The Monster Guys. You can check us on Facebook and Instagram as well, but have a little bit of a conversation with us and let us know what your thoughts are and what perspective you can bring to the conversation. I, for one, believe comedy belongs in horror, and I believe horror belongs in a lot of comedy too. But for now, I think I'm going to go watch Fright Night, so I need my Fright Night fix before Halloween, yes. Charlie Brewster, I'm coming for you. All right, everybody. Good night. Until next time, thank you for hanging out with us here on Welcome to the Red Table. If you want some more good stuff from us, look us up on the Monster Guys podcast. I think right now we have our series Monsters Among Us happening for the month of October, and that's where we're dealing with some real life horror stories.
As somebody that is having to research a lot of that, some of those, they'll get you in the mood for Halloween.
Yes. we're giving you counseling sessions with a professional, and you're watching Fright Night. So,
isn't it the same thing?
I think so. Good night, everybody. Take care, and be safe this Halloween. Show us your costumes. Take a picture and send it to us on Twitter, @TheMonsterGuys. See ya.